Hello, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Doug Elmendorf. I'm the Dean of the Kennedy School, and I'm glad to be greeting you this evening. We are delighted to have Yuval Levin as our guest speaker in the forum today. Yuval is the founding editor and current editor of National Affairs, which is a quarterly journal of essays about domestic policy, political economy, culture, and more. Yuval is also the director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. As you probably know, AEI is one of the leading Washington think tanks, and its president for a decade was Arthur Brooks, who is now on the Harvard faculty and whom I will come back to in a moment. Yuval Levin has a PhD from the University of Chicago and has worked at the White House and on Capitol Hill for the US Congress. He's published his essays and articles in every publication you can think of, and has written several books, including most recently, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting Our Institutions to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Yuval is one of the country's most creative and thoughtful voices on public policy and society, and we are very fortunate that he has agreed to join us today. Yuval will be in conversation with our own Arthur Brooks. Arthur is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at the Kennedy School, and also a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. Arthur is himself an especially creative and thoughtful voice on public policy and society, so we are in for a treat this evening. Arthur and Yuval, let me hand the microphone over to both of you.
Thank you, Doug. And thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. It's a delight and an honor for me to be in conversation with my old friend, Yuval Levin, somebody that I've worked with and I've admired for many years. And to have him virtually here in our community at the Harvard Kennedy School, a wonderful community that's welcoming of and embracing a competition of ideas in a world that doesn't seem very ready for a competition of ideas, or seems kind of tired of a competition of ideas, one that wants kind of one voice. It seems, depending on what your side of the aisle you're on, that will dictate the voice that you want to hear, or that a lot of people want to hear. We don't believe that here. We actually believe in hearing from a lot of different perspectives, and that's why we're so honored to have Yuval Levin with us. The fact that we don't want a multiplicity of voices in America, or so it seems, is the topic of our conversation here. I'll add a little bit to Doug Elmendorf's really gracious introduction of Yuval, which is that just a little bit about his background. He went to college at American University in Washington, D.C. before doing his PhD at the University of Chicago. He did a lot of different things before joining the American Enterprise Institute in public policy. He was a special assistant to the president for domestic policy under George W. Bush. He was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. So he has a wide span of expertise. He is, in my view, the leading conservative intellectual of our time, and he's young at that. He follows the traditions of William F. Buckley, of Irving Kristol, of Milton Friedman, of the giants of American conservative thinking. And if there's a chance for the American conservative movement, perhaps for the Republican Party, but for the conservative movement to re-find its footing in the United States today after some very jarring and dislocating years, it's going to come from the ideas of a person like, and in the person of Yuval Levin, in my view. I strongly recommend to everybody who finds his remarks interesting tonight to go read his books, especially A Time to Build and The Fractured Republic, his last two books, both of which are really outstanding and illuminating. So welcome, Yuval. It's nice to see you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Arthur. It's really good to be with you. I'm not only thankful for the invitation, but thankful to be able to spend this time with you in particular. As an AI scholar, I work in the house that Arthur built, and you're missed. But you know, I have to tell everybody that the stamp of Arthur Brooks is really on everything that is good about AI, and especially that spirit of open inquiry that you started with, Arthur, and the commitment to the dignity of every person. I mean, it's really something you brought to Washington in a way that we really needed. And I, for one, am always grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Well, I appreciate that a lot. And that's a commitment to the radical equality of human dignity is something, is a value that you share and that we believe in very strongly here at the Kennedy School. I started off my remarks by talking about the bitter, contemptuous divides that we find in the United States. And there are people from all across the political spectrum that are listening to us or watching us this evening. You know, some people on the progressive left all the way through to the conservative right. And it's the winds that are buffeting us are telling us that you can't trust people on the other side, that the biggest threat to America is people who disagree with us. And people who are trying to be commentators more or less in the middle, or at least fair brokers, will often tell me, and they've told you, that it's never been this bad, that it's not been this bad maybe ever in America. But you're a conservative and you're leery of such pronouncements. So what say you? Is this the worst time ever?
Well, that's a question that allows even me to be cheerful and optimistic, because surely it's not the worst time ever. I do think that we are living in a moment where our political culture, and you might say the infrastructure of our politics and our civic life in some respects, has broken down in some powerful ways. And that means that it's hard for us to overcome the problems we do have. I don't think the problems we have themselves are worse than what this country's faced before. There have been much tougher times to be an American, to try to lead this country, or to try to be part of its civic life and political life. But I think that there's a way in which the frameworks that we would use to solve big problems are what have become weaker in our time. And that does make it harder to know how to go about making things better. And I think in particular, that kind of debilitating polarization, the sense that each party has that the country's biggest problem is the other party, is what debilitates our politics. It means that we don't really have the kind of traditional public policy debates that can enable us to find some common ground or to address problems. Instead, a lot of our debates are about how terrible those other people are and how do we get rid of them, or how do we overcome them. And, you know, at some level, that's what politics always is. But politics has to be focused on an arena that compels us to accommodate each other, to accept each other's existence. You know, this term civility, which people throw around as if it just means being nice to each other, I think that term really means beginning from the premise that the people you disagree with are still going to be there tomorrow. And a lot of our politics now is based on a desire to reject that premise and to find a way for those people to not be there tomorrow. And that's a politics that cannot work. So in a lot of ways, it is terribly dysfunctional. But I don't think our problems are worse than ever. And I do think this country is up to rising to this challenge once we really understand it in the right terms.
I mean, you're restating in different terms the words of Dr. King, who talked about the importance, if you want to persuade your enemy, you must redeem your enemy. And the only way that you can do that is to be in conversation with your enemy. In other words, you can't insult somebody into agreement. And the idea of utterly vanquishing our foes through coercion once and for all, well, it's insane to begin with, and it's impossible. So why wouldn't we look for a better way unless we're on track to meet a different set of incentives, not one of progress, but rather one of signaling or trying to power, and that's where we're going. Now, you alluded to the idea that our cold civil war has to do with the fact that something has broken down. Something has broken down. What's broken down? Is this institutions? Is it culture? What is it that's broken down? And then I'm going to ask you why it broke down.
I think that really is the crucial question. We're living in a time that we can pretty readily see as a kind of social crisis, whether that's through polarization or the bitter culture war we've got, or even a lot of people's personal lives, isolation, alienation, loneliness. These are signs of crisis. But what is broken down has been hard to pin down. And I think part of the reason for that is that we in this free society tend to be blind to institutions. We want to look through them. We want to imagine we don't need them. And when they're working, that's great. That makes us feel even more free than we are. But when they're not working, we can't see what's not working. And I think the answer to that really is at its core an institutional answer. It's those structures, those forms of our life together that are failing us now. And we have to see our institutions. That means both in civic life, in our communities, and in our politics, to really see the way in which a commitment to institutional obligations, forms, responsibilities, roles, to ask ourselves in a moment of decision, given the role that I have here, how should I behave, just doesn't come naturally to us at this point. And I think that then encourages and enables a kind of cultural collapse that we see more readily. We can see our culture is broken down, but I think it's much harder for us to grasp that a lot of that has to do with institutions. In politics, for example, we have institutional frameworks that are meant to enable us, even to compel us, to accommodate each other, to bargain, to compromise, to deal with each other. When those forms don't work, then we don't feel any pressure, any incentive, any force that drives us to do that. And instead, we can talk to people who agree with us. We can speak into an echo chamber. We can always be performing and never actually engaging with problems. And I think in a lot of ways, that's where we've ended up in many of our institutions.
So be more specific about the institutions. So are you talking about, in the vernacular of my colleague Bob Putnam, that we're bowling alone too much? Or in the vernacular of a lot of religious leaders that say that the nuns, as in N-O-N-E-S, people who are not religiously affiliated, has gone from about 3% of the population in 1970 to about 30% of the population, and it's over 60% for people who are under 30 years old? Are you talking about the fact that Congress can't function anymore, or has its power has been usurped by the presidency? What kind of institutions are we talking about? Civil, political, business, media, or all of it?
I think there's a set of forces that affects all of these institutions. And to see it, we have to start by asking ourselves, what really are institutions? I think that obviously you can, the academic literature on this is endless. But broadly speaking, institutions are the durable forms of our life together, the shapes, the structures of what we do together. Some of those are organizations, right, like a university or a corporation. Some of those are less corporate than that, but still essentially they're forms of common action, like the family, a profession, the rule of law as an institution. And what institutions do, in a very important sense, is not only that they enable us to work together with one another, but in the process, they form us. They shape us to be capable of that kind of common action. They shape our character, they shape our soul, our habits. And that kind of shaping is how we build what Putnam calls social capital, right? That's institutions build that capital. We have a lot of ways of spending social capital now in American life. I think we're awfully short on ways of amassing it. And that's because that happens inside functional institutions. And what you see in a lot of our institutions now is not just a traditional kind of corruption, where rather than forming people to be trustworthy or responsible, they enable various kinds of misbehavior. That certainly happens too, but it always happens. There's something distinct about this moment where we've come to think of our institutions less as formative in that way and more as performative, as platforms to stand on and express ourselves or build a following or build our brand. And so people in positions of power, of real institutional responsibility, understand themselves not as constrained and shaped by those institutions, but as elevated and displayed by them. Members of Congress run for Congress basically to get a bigger social media following, a better time slot on cable news. They spend all their time performing rather than working within the institution. You could look at Donald Trump in the presidency in the same way. He just used it as a stage for the same kind of one-man show that he's always been putting on his entire adult life. I think you see that same kind of process of moving from formative to performative in an awful lot of our institutions, in corporate America, in the academy, in the media. Think about journalism, where journalism is a formative institution. Its power, its authority comes from the fact that it subjects journalists to a process that enables us to have some trust in what they tell us. But a lot of elite journalists now step out of that process on their own onto a platform like Twitter and display themselves as individuals on that platform, building their following literally. And that makes it much harder to trust them. This kind of transformation has a lot to do with the public's loss of trust in institutions. And in turn, with a sense we have that our institutions in America are not really working for us. A lot of Americans now look at our society and say, that's for other people. That's not for me. That they talk about our country in the third person plural, not in the first person plural, not as we and us and our, but as they, those people. And I think that's just another way of describing that crisis.
So let me summarize a little bit, and you tell me if I'm apprehending this right. I'm just sort of the through line of the argument is that basically a degradation of trust has made it such that we have less loyalty to institutions, less membership in institutions, less participation in institutions across society. And that means that we're less beholden to each other, less linked to each other, we're less necessary to each other. A good example of that is what's happened in our political parties, as expressed in the leaders themselves, who see the political parties not as a way to work together to get things done, to be linked to citizens and to have to work with people with whom they disagree, but rather as a platform for their own personal aggrandizement. And the sine qua non of this fundamental phenomenon is the meltdown of the Republican Party and the election of Donald Trump. Is this your argument?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think trust, beginning from trust, is the right way to start here, because trust is really at the center of a lot of what we've been losing. And those very few institutions that are still trusted, what really stands out about them is that they're unabashedly formative. The one great exception to all the public opinion polling about loss of trust, for example, among our national institutions, is the military. Now, why is that? It's not just because the military is good at its job. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the military is unabashedly formative. We have a sense that it takes men and women and turns them into better human beings. We don't really think that about a lot of our other institutions. We don't think of them as holding the people within them up to a standard that makes those people more trustworthy. And that's really what it takes for an institution to be trusted.
Why did we degrade our trust so much in institutions, including in the institutions that we use as platforms? It's very interesting. I hear people, college professors like me, bashing universities, members of Congress, trashing Congress. I hear, people in the media talking about the corruption of the media. They don't even believe in their own institutions. So take me back in time to the beginning of this crisis. When Doug and I were little kids and you weren't born yet, did the problem exist? Did it start in the 60s? Did it start in the 80s? When did this problem start?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some ways, of course, this is so overdetermined that any answer I could give you would be right. But I think it's important to see that in a lot of ways, this began as a response to what now seems to us like the most foreign problem possible, which is an overly strong and confident set of institutions in American life. If you look at American culture in the middle of the 20th century, say in the 1950s, early 60s, what you find is a culture that is screaming to be liberated from strong institutions, a culture that had a sense that it was being pressed to conform. And everywhere you look, there were pressures to be liberated from that conformity, not just on the left, not just in the kind of, James Dean popular culture. Read the opening editorial of the first issue of National Review, 1955. We know it, if we do, only because it said, standing athwart history, yelling stop. 99% of that editorial, what it actually said was that we needed to fight the forces of conformity. We needed to fight bigism. Read the average Martin Luther King Jr. sermon from the 1950s. So before the late 50s, early 60s, when he really became the leading light in the civil rights movement. A lot of those sermons are about the dangers of bigism, the dangers of conformity, moral conformity. And the America that came out of the Second World War and the Depression was intensely cohesive and conformist and wanted to be liberated. And it began a process of liberalization for some very good reasons. Some of that was economic liberalization, more of a market orientation in the economy to give people more options, more choices, more dynamism, growth. Some of it was cultural liberalization. Again, more openness, more variety, more diversity, letting people who had been pushed to the margins have more of a role in the life of our society. These are very positive things. But in the process, gradually over time, all of the forces that had been telling every American to be more like everyone else at mid-century began telling every American to be more like yourself by the end of the 20th century. And you reach a point where a politics and culture of liberty, which is really what we had for much of the past two generations, began to be short on sources of solidarity. And I think one way to understand the contemporary moment is that we are living with a hunger for solidarity, and the right and the left in different ways are stumbling to find ways to answer that need, to speak to that hunger. They're not doing very well at it so far, but I think it is what they're looking to do, what they're trying to address. And we are entering a phase in our politics that, alongside a commitment to liberty, I think is going to be defined by a commitment to solidarity. In some ways, that might mean more of a sense of nationalism, more of a sense of American cohesion. In other ways, it will mean solidarity to subgroups, solidarity to identity groups, solidarity to something to belong to. That's what everybody's screaming for at the moment. And, you know, this has begun in some dark ways that I think are very troubling. But ultimately, the desire for solidarity is healthy and necessary. And that hunger for solidarity is just another way to describe this crisis of alienation and loneliness that we live with.
So freedom rang after in the hearts of Americans after the Second World War. We yearned to be freer as people, as individuals, to express ourselves. And in so doing, there was a natural cost, which was to the bonds of solidarity that would have typically defined the United States. I get that. Now, once again, to go back to the great Bob Putnam, he says that there are two kinds of social capital. There are two kinds of civic bonds. The one is bonding social capital, which is your identitarianism. It's everything from the identitarian politics on the right to the identity politics that we talk about on the left. It's like my group, and you're not in my group, and it's in group and out group, and that seems to be the problem. And that is the struggle for solidarity that you said, that the expression of the struggle for solidarity that you're talking about. But Bob Putnam talks about, and so do so many others. You know, James Coleman and so many other scholars have talked about bridging social capital. That's what Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about, as you referred to him. And bridging social capital is the idea that we can make common cause with people who are different than us, many times because they are different than us. Those of us who are major proponents of expanded immigration, it's on the basis of the idea of bridging social capital. More new people, please. More different kinds of people, please. And so the question that I have is, are those ideas antagonistic? You know, is it possible for us to actually keep the freedom that has created somewhat of an atomized society by rebuilding the solidarity that comes from bridging social capital? And if it is possible, tell me how to do it, Yuval.
I certainly think there is a tension, and Bob Putnam and others think this too, between bonding and bridging. There's certainly a tension between openness and solidarity, we might say. And that tension is just a tension we live with. That is, the answer to bonding or bridging is yes, you need both. And the fact that their intention is just a fact of life. They may be contradictory in theory, but they're not contradictory in practice. And the challenge that they pose to us is, how do we live in ways that encourage both? And that, to me, takes us back to the question of strong institutions. Because strong institutions, whether that's a strong church or synagogue, whether that's a school that sits at the center of a community, whether that's a workplace that takes its workers' thriving seriously, or whether it's a political institution, enable us to both bond and bridge. That is, to be engaged in common action together that gives us a common identity without requiring us to start in the same place. That's very often the challenge of social cohesion. And it means we need to be more than individuals. When we think about the challenge we face, we very often have this image in our minds of American life as a big open space with lots of individuals trying to hold hands, and they're having trouble doing it. So we talk about building bridges, we talk about breaking down walls. But the fact is that we need more than just individual connectedness. We do need structures of social life, ways of acting together. And if our country is a big open space, it's not just filled with individuals. It's filled with these structures. It's filled with institutions. And some attention to institutions is really necessary in a moment like this. And it's necessary from each of us. That is, we each have to think of our own personal ambition, responsibilities, drive through the lens of some institution that matters to us. And our goal needs to be not just to build up ourselves, but to do it by way of building up an institution. And, you know, institutions empower us by giving us roles, by constraining us, by giving us responsibilities. And so that can be challenging, right? They force us into something like a mold, like a box, and we might chafe at that. But I think this is a moment when we have to see that that kind of formation is really the only way to link that kind of bridging and bonding, as you say, these two elements that are just required for a healthy social life. There's no getting around the need for both.
So give me tangible examples of the institutions that real ideas. So you're talking to people who say, it's like Dr. Levin, I want to make a difference. I want to make this better. The difference is going to start with me. And you say, get involved with institutions that don't just define your bonds, but provide your bridges. I got it. Give me an example.
Well, you have to begin from the problems that matter to you and from the people that matter to you. So very often that means thinking in bottom-up terms. Think about an institution in your community, again, a church, a school, a civic organization, a company that's doing something that you think is making things better. And ask yourself, how can I have a role in that institution? Or better yet, think about an institution where you do have a role, whether that's your family, whether that's your church, whether that's your work. And ask yourself, given that role, how can I make a difference? Given the responsibilities that I have to people here, to people who work for me, people who I work for, to people who I sit with every Sunday, given the kind of relationships I have with them, what can we do together? I think there's a tendency too often to think about problems in terms of why aren't those people over there solving these problems? And, Americans are at our best when we think about how can we over here solve these problems. Alexis de Tocqueville has a kind of joke in one of his letters to his father when he was in America in the 1830s, where he says you get three Americans together and they elect a treasurer. We do have that kind of instinct about us, but I think we've lost it a little bit. And we've lost it a bit because we live in a kind of culture of expression where we think that putting that thumbs up next to that great post on Facebook means we've really done something about this. We've shown that we're on the right side. And I think we have to learn that expression isn't really action most of the time. And we have to think about the models that we live with. So in thinking about, for example, questions of race that have come up in America in the past year, we do have in our mind the successful model of the civil rights movement. But too often that model feels to us like it's a bunch of protests. So we need to protest. But that's not really what the strength of the civil rights movement was. Those protests were expressions of communal strength. They were expressions of institutional force. They were saying, I can bring 10,000 people to Washington, and that means I can bring 1 million people to the ballot on election day. And I think we've gotten much less good at connecting those things now. It's seeing that expression has to be an expression of underlying action, that we have to be building institutions and rebuilding institutions in ways that enable us to actually act together in the world. And that's just a set of habits that we as Americans have to recover for ourselves. We have to see this as a time to be building and rebuilding.
So let's move more explicitly now to sort of the stated theme of this conversation, which, we've been talking about America and the world and all of us. But the title of this presentation is The Future of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party is an institution. It's an institution that, according to your writing, at one point actually provided a whole lot of bridging social capital. It even, at its best, bridged to the Democratic Party because it was a representative institution of American democracy in all of its goodness. And you have argued, I think persuasively, that it is no longer that today. So tell me and us how the Republican Party can get back to where it once was and where it should be to fulfill the aims and objectives that you've articulated here tonight.
Well, so some of this can apply to both of our major parties, and some problems are really distinct at this moment to the Republican Party, and we can talk about both. I think, for one thing, our parties are an example of what it looks like when an institution transforms from a mold into a platform. The purpose of our parties really is to shape the political arena. And ultimately, although this is now really counterintuitive for us, the parties actually exist to moderate our politics. If you're the Republican Party and you have to elect candidates in both Alabama and Oregon, you have an incentive to offer up an agenda that can have some pretty broad appeal. When you weaken the parties, as we've done, and empower individual politicians instead, that politician doesn't have that same incentive. He or she is running only in Alabama or in Oregon, and so needs to appeal only to the most intense, committed voters in that place alone. And that means that they will incline to speak to the converted, to preach to the choir, and to move toward the edges of our politics rather than toward the middle. Stronger parties that understand themselves as having a kind of formative role are more likely to be more moderate. But what we've seen happen to our parties, in part because of campaign finance reforms, in part because of the changes in the political culture more generally, is that they've become platforms for narcissists. They've just become a place to stand and put on your own show. And in that sense, I think both parties have become weaker. They have less control over their own agenda, their own candidate selection. And we've seen the rise of politicians who are much more like narcissists on the one hand, and the rise of politicians who just speak to that choir on the other hand. Now, it also has to be said that the Republican Party in particular, in the last few years, and especially because of Donald Trump, although you also have to think about what made Trump's rise possible, has become a populist party in a way that has left it embittered about our institutions, hostile to them in many ways. I think conservatives, and the Republican Party has been a home to conservatives for more than a half century now. I think conservatives are naturally defenders of a society's institutions. Not blindly, they're also reformers, but they believe in the purposes of those institutions. And the Republican Party has gradually become hostile to American institutions. It sees them as possessed by the other party. It sees them as corrupt. It looks at them through a populist lens as the source of the problem rather than the source of solutions. And, you know, I think an American right that is hostile to institutions is not healthy for our politics. And it seems to me that in order to recover its capacity to serve the country, the Republican Party has to recover its love for our institutions. We can't say, even, you know, we love the Constitution, but we hate the Congress and the presidency and the courts. Those are the Constitution. We can't say that we stand for America, but we don't like its culture, we don't like its economy, and we don't like its politics. Well, that's, you know, at some level, even if we want to be critical of the people who are running our institutions, we have to speak up for their underlying purposes, for what a great university is for, not just why the universities are so terrible now, for what it would mean for our institutions to serve their purposes. So I'm a conservative, and, you know, I'm a Republican in the sense that the Republican Party is a home for conservatives, but it's become a much more uneasy home for conservatives in recent years. And I think it's necessary to do the work to make it more of a home for that, because a free society needs conservatives.
And this relates back to the point at the early part of the conversation that how ironic it is that the atomization of society is made manifest in people attacking their own institutions and getting credibility from trashing their own homes. Yep. When I first moved to Washington, D.C., somebody asked my wife, Esther, how do you like Washington? She said, it's wonderful, except for the traffic and the weather and the people. And you get that seems to be what's coming from that. Okay, so my last question before we turn it over to our friends in the audience is once again the how. Once again the how. Like, you know, you and I are think tank guys, and you know, people are coming to you, Yuval. I know they are because they tell me they are, to say, okay, that's the right set of solutions theoretically. Now, Yuval is the head of the Republican National Committee. What's his first move?
Yeah, you know, as William F. Buckley said when he ran for mayor of New York City, if I won that race, I would demand a recount. I think I think there are a couple of ways to think about what's gone wrong, and they all have to do with the perverse incentives that confront people in the political system now. Politicians are not crazy and they're not stupid. They're behaving the way they're behaving for serious reasons. And those reasons have to do with the kinds of political incentives that they face. And right now, almost all those incentives are for this kind of performative, narcissistic politics. They're for treating politics as a stage in front of a camera, for putting on a show. And I think to get our politics back to a place where they're ultimately about how to solve public problems, we've got to think about those incentives. That means that we have to think about how various kinds of electoral changes could help us to have better politicians. I, for one, for example, and this is maybe an unusual view for a conservative, but I'm very interested in ideas like ranked choice voting and multi-member districts in the House, because I think all of those ideas are ways of enabling greater factionalization within each of our parties that would create more room for compromise, for bargaining, for accommodation. I think that's what's really missing in our politics. That's what the core institution of our politics, the US Congress, is for. And when we think about how to reform Congress and how to reform the system, we need to think about how to do it in the direction of more incentives for bargaining and accommodation, how to compel that kind of bargaining. So I don't think, for example, in terms of getting rid of the filibuster, which would be a way to make bargaining less necessary, not to make it more likely. I think instead, in terms of changes to the budget process that would allow members to actually have more of an influence on what comes out of legislation, I think of ways of empowering committees, letting congressional committees have some control of floor time, take it back from the leaders, as many state legislatures do. I think of ways of, for example, breaking down the barrier between authorization and appropriation, for those of you who are just a little bit of a Congress nerd. These are all ways of investing the ambition of politicians in the inside work, in the work of legislating, rather than in the outside work, in the work of performing for an audience. And right now, there are very, very few incentives for an ambitious politician to, make his or her name as a legislator. And that needs to change if we're going to get to a place where our parties are more focused on how to solve problems. So maybe that's where I'd start.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. And I promised that was my last question, but I lied because I have one more quick one before we go to the audience. A lot of the people in our audience are political progressives, somewhere to the left, to the center of the spectrum. So they don't see the world the way that you do. They're not as concerned about the success of the Republican Party as you are, or the conservative movement as you are. Explain to the liberals, the progressives, the people on the left in our audience, why they should want the Republican Party to get better and to be a successful, functional party.
Well, I think ultimately our politics only works when it is an arena for accommodation and compromise. And that means that each party has some interest in the health of the other. You can't achieve your own goals if the system is set up in such a way that you have to view the other party as the country's biggest problem and it views you as the country's biggest problem. Right now, the way in which both of our parties operate basically means that what they're trying to solve is the other party. And that's a politics that cannot work in our society. It especially can't work in a time when the parties are actually pretty evenly divided. It's easy to look at the Republican Party and say, what a mess. But the Republican Party, is sort of the governing party of the country below the national level. It's much stronger at the state and local level than the Democratic Party at the moment. And it's pretty even at the national level. We have a tied Senate. We have an almost tied House. The last presidential election was relatively close. So we're not in a moment where one party is just going to overpower the other. And that means that if you're going to achieve anything, you need a functional political culture. And that means that each party has some interest in the health of the other. There's no way around it. We need each other.
So if I summarize that, the argument is you should not want to live in a place or in a community, or for that matter, even in a family where everybody agrees with you, because you're probably wrong, at least sometimes, and you should want to know first, not last. And only a functional interlocutor that has some intellectual and emotional control can help you to become better. Is that
absolutely? And by the way, I think that's a way of thinking about the challenge of unity that troubles so many of us now. The problem we have is not that we are not good at agreeing with each other. The problem we have is that we're not good at disagreeing with each other. And the institutions we have for enabling that are dysfunctional.
Wonderful. This is maybe the quote of the evening from Yuval, Levin. We shouldn't disagree less, we should disagree better. I'm going to start with a question from Lap, who's a student at Harvard College. Lap, what's on your mind?
Hi, Director Levin. Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. My question to you is, it seems that in the recent weeks, there seems to be continuing acquiescence from the moderate wing of the Republican Party, seemingly from political leaders like Senator Mitch McConnell or House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, and kind of more supporting kind of the Trump wing or allowing kind of more of that politics to play out. And so my question to you is, should center-right politicians and center-right individuals in this country maybe be willing to split off from the Republican Party, or what are some of the best ways that they can kind of come back and retake control of the party, seeing as it continues to kind of shift towards the Trumpism side of the spectrum?
Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful question, and obviously on the minds of a lot of people on the right. I mean, I would say the challenge at the moment, the question of the moment about the future of the party is really whether former President Trump remains a driving force, remains the central question. And, there is a wing of the party that wants the answer to be no, but wants that to happen by just kind of allowing him to fade away. And I think that's a strategy that a lot of people have clung to for the last 5 years and hasn't worked. Now, look, it could work now. He's a former president, right? He's not moving the political world with his words anymore. His shtick could get boring, and boredom is deadly to that kind of performance art. But nonetheless, I don't think that just waiting around and saying that let's hope this fades away is going to be enough. I think that it has to be confronted somehow. I don't think that in the American system, breaking off is really a viable strategy. And that's because the structure of our two-party system is very entrenched in state law and in the shape of our political culture, so that starting a third party is always a challenge. And, for a minority of one of our parties to try to do that, probably a small minority, we don't really quite exactly know, but, who would want to be part of such a party, isn't really the way. I think that the challenge is, how do you regain control of the party so that it can again speak for the various wings of the American right, rather than be about Donald Trump? You would think the case for that should be pretty easy. Why would a national political party want to be about a former president who lost re-election? But obviously, for the moment, it has not been that easy at all. And I'm more inclined to think that the strategic instincts of people like Liz Cheney and a few others who are inclined to be more aggressive about making the case for putting Trump behind the party, rather than putting the party behind Trump, is right. That needs to be argued. That it actually needs to be said and done, rather than sitting around and waiting for it to happen. But look, that's easier for me to say than for them. I don't have to run for office. I can write what I think, and I still have my job the next day. So it's hard to blame them, but I do think that a passive strategy here is not likely to succeed.
Next question comes from Ryan, also a student at Harvard College.
Right. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming here this evening to speak with us. My question, Lap, first of all, stole my question, but I had a second question on my mind. For the Republican Party, I think one of the big challenges that it's facing in terms of being able to unify the party and kind of break away from this trend of like moral compromise for kind of half the party is, and one of the big problems is the party's youth. I think we kind of see in this new congressional class of Republicans that there's some volatility in some of the rhetoric they've been using, and a lot of controversy has come around that in a time where perhaps the Republican Party was, or Republican thinkers like yourself maybe wanted some more returning to the older times. How do you think the Republican Party can mobilize its youth to better make this change and unify the party?
Well, the question you raise is really important to both parties. I think that the question of generational change in our politics is really essential, and in some ways that are actually quite unusual. Our political leadership at the moment in the United States is very unusually elderly. The president is 78, his predecessor was 74, the Speaker of the House is 80, the Majority Leader of the Senate is a sprightly young 71, right, running rings around all of them. that's very unusual for so many of our leaders to be over 70 is an odd situation. And it's not that it's just you got to wait till you're 70 to run things. It's actually that these same people, this same generation, has actually been running things in both parties for a very long time. You think about, for example, Donald Trump was born in June of 1946. George W. Bush was born in July of 1946. Bill Clinton was born in August of 1946. When you start looking around, a lot of our institutions, actually, not just in politics, you find a lot of people born in the mid-1940s. That's bizarre. And one of the things that it suggests is that we are at the brink of a generational transition, and that some of the assumptions that are natural to the older baby boomers, and which have been so dominant in our political culture for so long, will undergo some change. And on both the right and the left, that will mean some meaningful changes. I think the question for the right, I mean, in some ways, the Trump movement is an older baby boomer movement. A lot of his stronger supporters are also in their 60s and 70s in the party. And younger voters are a little less attached to Trump, even if they're inclined to be nationalistic or if their views on immigration are similar to his in some cases. The question of what will define the next generation of Republicans, how they'll think about politics, is a very open question right now. And in some ways, that's true of the Democrats, too. I think there's a real, the fact that our leaders are so old means our politics isn't really about the future much of the time. Just ask yourself how much of what was talked about in the 2020 election was about what America's going to need in 20 years, right? And in 2040, what is this country going to need that it doesn't have now? That's what our politics should be about. But it's very rarely about that at this moment. And I think the challenge for your generation, even for my generation, I'm 43, I'm kind of in the middle here, in that small generation that's just going to get run over. The question for us is, how do we turn our politics forward to the future? And rather than think about who was at fault for what and how to settle old arguments, we need to think about what we have to offer the future. And at the moment, the left and right both really face a challenge of how to show the country what they have to offer the future. And so, to me, in a way, that's maybe restating your question more than answering it. But I think that is the crucial question, is what are you saying to a rising generation of Americans about what you can offer them in the coming decades? It seems to me that our politics in general is doing a very poor job of that right now.
I want to turn now to Alice Stewart, who is an Institute of Politics Senior Advisory Board member. Alice, over to you. We have Alice here. Okay, I think that maybe there's a technical difficulty, so we'll come back to Alice, and we're going to go to Ajay, who's a student at Harvard College. Ajay. What do we have here? Looks like we have another technical difficulty. Is that Alice? Is that Alice or Ajay? I don't know. I can't tell. Okay, let's look at the next, or we can go on to more conversation on our end here. Waiting for my cue.
I think that might have been Alice earlier. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
But hi, my name is Ajay. I'm a sophomore at Harvard College, calling in from St. John's, Florida, right outside of Jacksonville. So my question sort of has to do, a bit with the theme of unity and whether the Republican Party can truly unite Americans, at least in its current state. So as it is now, and as it has been for a very long time, the religious right, specifically the evangelical Christian right, has sort of dictated the Republican Party's positions on a lot of social issues, especially. But the demographics of the country are, as was noted earlier, shifting. Almost 30% of American adults don't really subscribe to a particular faith. But out of the, out of, I guess, the many now non-Christian members of Congress, only 2 are Republicans. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, if the Republican Party wants to sort of be a leader in terms of both social and economic values, how do they, position themselves to lead socially when so many Americans just have, fundamental disagreements with Christian values, whether that's because they aren't Christian or they, it's like, I guess, and is a more secular conservatism even possible in America when, I guess, evangelicalism is so wound up with tradition?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I should say I'm a non-Christian Republican. I'm Jewish, and so speak at this from the outside, and inclined to be careful and respectful as a result. I think that I'd say a few things. I think right now both parties are exceptionally unified on social issues, and actually unusually divided on economic issues. And that is strange. That is an unusual situation. I think if you'd looked in on American politics at most points in the past 2 generations, you would have found that our 2 parties each tends to be unified around economic issues, role of government, that kind of thing, but internally divided on social issues, so that you'd have arguments within the Democratic Party about abortion, for example. You'd have arguments within the Republican Party about some social issues, but not many arguments about the role of government. Right now, there are arguments within the Republican Party about the role of government, very fundamental arguments, and in some sense among the Democrats too. But Republicans are socially conservative and unified around those issues in pretty firm ways. Now, some of the issues that are prominent have changed. I would say that you find now that kind of social conservatism comes to be expressed almost as a cultural attitude, more than a view about abortion, say. It comes to be a kind of view about religious freedom, or a view about political correctness or cancel culture. These are stand-ins for the social issues that I think in part come from a recognition of the kinds of changes you're describing. They actually are more secular approaches to the social issues in some ways. But that said, I think that the tendency we're going to see in the evolution of our politics in the coming years probably will be toward internal party divisions over economic issues, and 2 very strong cohesive parties on social issues. The Republican Party is actually stronger for its social issue positions electorally, and the Democratic Party actually pays a price for some of its social liberalism. So that Republicans are not facing a strong pressure to liberalize on social issues, but they are increasingly divided on the role of government, for example. And so where we're going to see interesting divisions, I think actually will have to do less with the social issues in the near term. At least that's my read of the situation.
So Yuval, just as a quick follow-up question, the coalition politics in the Republican Party from the 1980s, which had the 3 legs of the conservative stool: national security, social issues, and the free enterprise system. Yeah. That's one of the reasons for the instability of the Republican Party, in your view, must be that the stool only has at most 2 legs, which is not a stable position. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the party, and in some ways the Democrats too, are sort of searching for a new set of organizing principles of how to define the nature of the coalition. Its electorate is changing in some ways, becoming a more working class electorate. Fewer Republican voters are college graduates than used to be the case. More Democratic voters are college graduates. The parties, Abraham Lincoln has this wonderful line about how the 2 parties wrestle with each other until they wrestle into one another's coats. And some of that is happening when you think about the changes in the electorate in recent years. So that evolution in the coalitions has to do, I think, also with the evolution in the sort of issue sets that you see. And obviously the end of the Cold War, more than anything, meant that 3-legged stool wasn't going to be the way the party organized itself.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go now to a Harvard alum, Paul. Paul's up next. Or maybe not. We're having
there we go. I needed to unmute.
Okay, we had a little technical difficulty, but hi, Paul.
Yeah, a couple of questions. First, the current palette of media available to politicians seems to really favor performative politics. Given that, plus 24-hour broadcast media, how do we move from performative politics, which seems to be really the inclination with the media that's available. The other question is, how do we start to shift the political agenda when wealth and super PACs are playing such a dominant role in determining the agenda?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two great questions, and they're somewhat related. I mean, I would say that we shouldn't overstate the power of cable news and other kinds of media in actually shaping the incentives that politicians face. You know, even on its best night, Fox News has maybe 3 million viewers in a country with 300 and something million people. And that's a very good night. And the same is true for MSNBC and CNN and so on. Most Americans don't get their news that way. Most Americans don't interact with politics through those forums. And I certainly think it's true that the evolution of news media and of social media has had to do with changes in our political culture. But it's been at least as responsive to those changes as it has been responsible for them. There's both a demand side and a supply side here. And I do think that thinking about how to change the incentives that confront politicians, how do you get elected? How do you make a name for yourself? How do you become recognized and prominent and important? Those are the kinds of incentives that move ambitious people, and politicians are ambitious people. So you have to think about the structure of Congress, the structure of elections with that in mind. And I do think it's possible to overcome some of these incentives in news media. On the money side, I would get us back to our discussion of parties a little earlier. I think that the way to make that system better is to allow more of the money in our politics to flow through the parties. And that's a counterintuitive idea for a lot of people involved in campaign finance reform. But the parties are a much healthier way to finance campaigns because, again, their incentive is to broaden the tent. And these outside groups that have been empowered by things like McCain-Feingold and other things, ironically empowered, it was not the intention of these reforms, but they've put all the power in outside groups that are often one-issue groups or are inclined to speak to a small constituency. And we need to think about how to broaden the message so that, again, the incentive is to speak to a larger audience, to speak to winnable voters, and to bargain. That's what politics needs to be about in our democracy.
We're almost out of time, Yuval. We've burned through an hour, but productively at that. I want to take 45 seconds and see if I can summarize for our audience the gist of your argument with your prescriptions, if you don't mind, and then you'll tell me if I do it right. Would you? And then we're going to turn it over to finish the show. Point number one is that an increase in the taste for liberty in America in the post-war era led to a scarcity of solidarity. In other words, we rebalanced in a way that was not entirely optimal. And the lack of solidarity led to the second problem, which is that our institutions, they were debased through a lack of trust, made common ground impossible to find in many institutions. Third, one of those institutions was the Republican Party, and for that matter, also the Democratic Party. Political parties went from a collective of people working together and working with the other side to performative platforms. That led to the current impasse, the culture of contempt, and indeed the theater that was the presidency of Donald Trump. Point four is that there's a solution. The solution is not more identity politics, not more performative politics, but more of a common American story that starts with institutions that build not just bonding social capital, but bridging social capital. And the answer in that application to the Republican Party is point five. To get a stronger Republican Party, we need one that dedicates itself not just to moderating extremes, which is really important, but also in defending institutions per se. And this leads to the last point, which is the prescription for all of us who are watching. What can each one of us do? If we want to embrace democracy, we have two imperatives. Disagree better with people that don't share a point of view and work together, especially with those with whom we disagree. Is that a fair summary?
That's wonderful, Arthur. This is why I miss you. You make other people sound smart. I very much appreciate that. And yes, that's a great summary.
it's an easy lift with Yuval Levin. I know that we're all really grateful to you for joining us, and you know, we would be clapping in person if we weren't all virtually clapping right now. Thank you for what you're doing for our country. Thank you for what you're doing, not just for the Republican Party, but for American democracy, for bringing your intellect in service of what we all really love and what we all really hold dear, which is a country that, in theory, still can be united. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to Grace Bannister to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Brooks and Dr. Levin, for a great discussion on the future of the Republican Party. You've certainly given us all a lot to think about, and we thank you guys for your time and for sharing your thoughts this evening. We're particularly pleased to have hosted this conversation tonight, as tomorrow marks the launch of the IOP's newest effort, the Conservative Coalition. The coalition will serve as a hub for all Harvard College students interested in developing their political identity through community and conversation, and will work as a thought partner across IOP programs to help develop representation of American political discourse and inclusion of students across the political spectrum. If you're an undergrad interested in getting involved with this coalition, please reach out to iopconservativecoalition@gmail.com after this event. And looking ahead in the forum, on Wednesday, March 24th, we're pleased to welcome Delaware Senator Chris Coons for a discussion around national service, the Biden agenda, and the 60th anniversary of the Peace Corps. Senator Coons has been a leading voice in the national service movement, member of the Senate Appropriations, Foreign Relations, Judiciary, and Small Business Committees, and chair of the Senate Ethics Committee. IOP Director and former Director of the Peace Corps, Mark D. Guerin, 78, will moderate this discussion. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to welcoming you back to the forum. Until then, take care and good night.